Hello and welcome. I'm Eric Greenleaf, and this is Healing from the Ground Up. Today, the second of our discussions, Healing the Wounded Warrior. And today, my guest, John Dyckman. Dr. Dyckman is a psychologist in private practice in Albany and a recent participant in a very interesting meeting with active duty officers of the United States Army in Washington. Would you tell us something about that, John?
Sure. Well, I was one of a number of psychologists who responded critically to the January 2011 issue of the American Psychologist, which quite frankly was an issue devoted entirely to the Army's new comprehensive soldier fitness program. And as one of my colleagues said, essentially this article was this issue was an infomercial for the program. It didn't adhere to the usual canons of scientific evidence, logic, or ethics. So a number of us independently wrote critical comments to the American Psychological Association. Mm-hmm. And to my surprise, about 10 months later, I received an formal invitation from the Department of Defense to attend a conference in Washington, D.C., which would be a, quote, frank discussion, exchange of ideas.
John, is this a program that originated in the Department of Defense?
Yes, it was. It was in response in large part to the dramatic increase in suicides. The Army has prided itself for many years of having a lower suicide rate than the general population, age-adjusted. If we consider that the average age of soldiers is 24, now that's a fairly high-risk period for suicide. But for years they've had a lower rate. Now they have the same rate, and it's climbing. So they're very concerned about the number of soldiers and active duty personnel who take their lives, plus the fact that the number of claims for service of returning veterans, particularly for service-related disabilities regarding post-traumatic stress disorder, which was in 2005 running about 20%, now running about 40% of the returning veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan.
That's quite a shocking number, John.
It's a shocking number, and it's met with varying degrees of varying responses. Some in the Army are saying these people are just soft, but the people I talked to actually took a very differentiated view. I was impressed with the intelligence of the people on up to the rank of Brigadier General, who now General, he was promoted shortly after the meeting, who are in charge of this program. It has an admirable goal, which is to try to reduce the psychological effects of combat on soldiers and to increase what they call resiliency in the troops. They said very clearly, we can requisition anything we want except fitness for duty. And so they're trying to find ways to make people more fit. So they teamed up with Martin Seligman, a psychologist from the University of Pennsylvania, who's been doing a lot of work in, quote, positive psychology and resilience training, to devise a very ambitious program for the Army that is mandatory now for all of the people in the Army, all the enlisted personnel, and is optional for their families.
They can participate.
They can participate
as well
in separate trainings, but also to have training in some of these same skills.
Well, John, this sounds on the face of it kind of admirable, because there are obvious trainings for soldiers like live fire exercises, even close combat, so that in very unusual situations in life, they can act decisively, take care of their buddies, attack the enemy, and so on, even with very frightening things and difficult and horrible things happening around them. But you and your fellow psychologists were very troubled by elements of the program. What did you tell the officers was of concern to you?
A number of things. One, we felt that the claims were absolutely premature and not founded.
Claims for?
Efficacy of this program.
Oh, whether it worked or not.
Whether it worked or not, and what it would work for. I think that let me describe the program briefly to you. There are two main elements. One is an assessment. Every year, every soldier has to take this GAT, which is a global assessment tool for fitness, and including emotional fitness, spiritual fitness. But the nature of this particular instrument, one, there's some serious psychometric problems, which I won't go into, but there are, suffice it to say whether it measures what it says.
Measures what it says.
What it says it's actually measuring. Two, it seems to be widely disregarded. 10% of the protocols are absolutely invalid, which means people just go down and press 111. Can't be scored. So it's not being taken very seriously. Three, there are concerns about confidentiality, even though the Army says it's confidential. Your fitness for duty, in part, depends upon this.
And is in your jacket.
And is in your jacket, although they would say there are protections for this. So there's an assessment tool of which we have a number of criticisms. There's also an intervention section, which is the Master Resilience Training, which is a variant of cognitive behavioral techniques to help people learn some emotional self-regulation skills, which are actually quite admirable and I think are appropriate. And as one of the generals pointed out, look, we've got 18 to 24-year-old risk takers who haven't come from the best social environments. These people really need these skills. And they do. They really do. But
in that way, a way to manage oneself and one's emotions in very difficult circumstances.
Exactly. Our beef
Not to go off the handle, let's say.
You got it.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely appropriate. Our concern was that this was being marketed and being sold to the Army at really quite a high cost, that all of us are paying, as a cure for PTSD, that this would prevent PTSD. And there's
a preventive.
Preventive. There's
not a cure, but
not
a preventive.
Cure, but a preventive. There's absolutely no evidence that supports that. Seligman's work was with high school students, and he found that teaching high school students these skills, and I think every high school student should learn these skills.
Very few have these skills.
Very few have these skills. It did reduce the number, the incidence of depression in these kids. However, it was a fairly small finding, and it's not been replicated. At least not, it doesn't hold up when you look at what's called a meta-analysis, which is looking at all the different studies that have been done using this method. It's a very, very small effect. And so we're saying this is really being presented for one thing, and there's very little evidence that it works for that. And we think people would be much better served by other kinds of prevention for PTSD, like not repeatedly deploying them to the same place.
So part of the objection was, you might say, professional, that what was being represented to the Army by professional psychologists was not accurate to the practices of research and research and intervention and so on. But this is another, and seems to me as serious a doubt about the program that, why don't you speak about that a little bit more?
Okay, well, when you think about the circumstances that occasion PTSD, what we know is the severity of a trauma seems to be the single best predictor. And then you have the repetition of the traumas and the compounding of the events. Now, being a soldier in a theater of war is inherently traumatic.
Yeah.
You know, periods of boredom punctuated by stark terror.
Yeah.
and also being in somebody else's country and watching the destruction of their country, the destruction, the death of women and children, the deliberate destruction of infrastructure, so that people no longer have electricity or water and are physically suffering the effects of your interventions. These are not pleasant experiences. And even the Army admits nobody comes back unaffected, which I thought was remarkably frank on their part.
And do you also think, as is implied by what you're saying, that if you expose any ordinary person and even any exceptionally resilient person to sufficient repeated measures of terror, distress, destruction, the death of those who depend on you and who you befriend, the death of innocence, that those repeated traumas are built in, hence the number going from 20% to 40% with a formalizable PTSD diagnosis.
Yes. I think they used to say in Vietnam, the vets that I've talked to say, well, I can hack anything for a year.
But suppose it's 2 or 3 years.
That's what's happening.
And you come home to New Jersey and then go back to Afghanistan.
Correct. That's correct. In fact, there's an interesting finding from studies of drone pilots. Yeah. These guys who sit in trailers and essentially play video games, only they're dropping bombs on people.
Yeah.
They're beginning to show PTSD symptoms as well, even though they're not in physical danger. And one of the theories is about this, which isn't proven yet, is it's the whiplash effect. These people, work 12 hours a day, and then they get off their shift and they take their kids to soccer, and then have dinner with their families. And then they go back in the next day and they kill people from afar again. And they see it in very graphic detail because of the optics. But interestingly enough, they're not getting complaints about the killing, but they are getting these same kind of symptoms that we see in post-traumatic stress disorder, the mood lability, going from apathy to irritability, from depression to anxiety, or anxiety depression usually is the form, and having flashbacks. So the question is, if they're not bothered so much by the moral effects of their acts, perhaps it's the contrast, the whiplash between you and I sitting here and talking, and then tomorrow we go kill people, and then we come back and we sit and we talk.
Might be that, and also in the formal definition of post-traumatic stress disorder, the criteria do not require that you yourself have been a victim of violence.
That's correct.
Or have perpetrated it. If you watched it, if you came by a bloody accident and saw children hurt, you could be haunted in that same way that qualifies, to put that word in quotes, for a diagnosis of PTSD.
Absolutely.
You could have nightmares.
Yes.
You could have disruptive rolling emotions or the absence of ordinary emotions. You could be hypervigilant driving your car or with your own kids.
True.
Even though you were never in combat or in an accident yourself. So when you talk about it, I think of a very pervasive or spreading set of disruptions that come through repeated observation of or direct experience of terror and trauma.
And it's interesting to get back to what you had said before about the repetition and the importance of repetition. The British found in the First World War that the helplessness, although they didn't talk about it quite that way, the fact that people were subjected to long periods of inactivity in a trench where there was really nothing they could do, and these artillery bombardments would periodically get lucky and land in the trench and kill a number of people.
Yeah.
And the 30 days was sufficient to turn even the most hardened soldier into somebody who was having difficulty sleeping, suffered in morale, began to have irrational outbursts. So that this has been known for a very long time.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a book which is somewhat controversial by Jonathan Shea called Achilles in Vietnam, the combat stress and the undoing of character, which goes back to the Iliad and looks at Achilles' behavior in part as a kind of PTSD.
That's very striking, John. And can I imagine that if you and your colleagues discussed the human emotional response to war and repeated deployment and so on with the combat officers, that affected them?
All of them had been in combat.
Yeah.
And they were frank and saying. The Brigadier General said, you know, I've seen things that I would not want my wife and children to see.
Yeah. And therefore things that are outside the family dinner table conversation, or even the intimate conversation of a husband and wife.
Yeah, absolutely. The Army tries to enfold all of this in a warrior ethos, and looking at this as a kind of the behavior of warriors, service before self. So that the loyalty, duty, and valor, same things you find in Bushido or the writings of Japanese warriors.
Or police or firemen.
Or police and firemen.
Or emergency medical technicians.
Yes, and I've actually known and treated PTSD in EMTs.
Yes.
At a certain point, the amount of actual suffering that they have witnessed and attended to begins to affect them.
In fact, I know a woman who was a therapist with CPS, the Child Protective Services, who after repeated deployments, you might say, and seeing so many kids being misused, had to stop. And I know another woman who had a kind of secondary PTSD from a therapist treating clients who had violent hallucinations from what source was unknown, but she would go home and have nightmares and look out her window fearfully and snap at her kids, and made me think that there is a normal response to trauma that should not quickly be called symptomatic or pathognomonic.
I agree with you. I believe that that what's happening to our soldiers and what's happening to people in situations such as you describe is a fairly normal human reaction. And what we were trying to get across to the Army is we would be more concerned if people didn't have some reaction to this. So the 3% of the population who are psychopaths or sociopaths who are not moved by the suffering of other people, these guys can get medals on the battlefield, but they're not people you want to have living next door to you. Nor, as we pointed out to them, they were not too happy. People like Timothy McVeigh, who learned how to blow up the Murrah building in the Army, and who went to his death professing to be a soldier, and that he was sacrificing his life for the ideals he felt were being misrepresented by the current government.
So what would you think I should rephrase the question. Do you think there are any approaches through resiliency that would maintain ordinary human feeling in those who've been traumatized. So that, for example, they would remain empathic, not only with their fellow soldiers, but also with the victims of bombing.
It's extraordinarily difficult to maintain empathy when your life is being threatened.
Yes.
Extraordinarily. I don't know anybody who I could say reliably does that. At a certain level of emotional arousal, the different parts of the body kick in. People defecate and urinate. Trained soldiers,
yes,
frequently in combat. There is just a remarkable built-in survival mechanisms that allow us to function, even in very extreme situations. But what we were arguing is that they do so at a cost, and that they do so at a cost, and that we need to appreciate that cost. That when we ask soldiers to do this repeatedly, we are asking them to undergo emotional damage, as well as the risk of catastrophic physical harm, and also moral injury.
Speak about that a bit, if you would.
Well, imagine what would happen if, you're driving your Humvee and a kid runs out into the street chasing his soccer ball. You don't know if that kid is being put up to running out in the street to slow you down so somebody can shoot you with a rocket-propelled grenade, and your commander is screaming in your radio to keep rolling, and you hit that kid, and you kill him. I can't imagine that you would come home to your child and not be affected by that by the memory of having struck and killed that child. That's a moral injury.
It is, and Sherman's famous comment that war is hell doesn't quite do the trick for what happens after the war.
Well, that's what I'm saying. It is hell. And Sherman, to his credit, whenever somebody, for years after the war, whenever somebody down on their luck showed up on his doorstep and said, "I fought with you in so-and-so," he'd reach into his pocket and give him whatever money he had. Because he was tortured by that, I'm sure, as well.
And your and your colleagues' view is clearly, and mine would be as well, these are unavoidable injuries of participation in war. Unavoidable.
I believe they are. I believe they are, and it's a very strong argument as far as I'm concerned. For one, limiting the number of times we put people into that. For, and I haven't figured this out very well, sharing that burden. Taking care of people when they come back, knowing that they've been injured, and most important, which they would not discuss with us, which was not being deployed in the first place. They said that's a matter of national policy. We're not going to get anywhere discussing that. We're essentially, we're the instrument of national policy, and we do what we're told. If you've got problems with it, take it up with your congressman.
Although before the volunteer army, and say in the Vietnam era, that was a public discussion. Should our nation be at war?
Absolutely.
In Vietnam? And also in the Iraq conflict, the same thing.
And there were actually, you can make the argument that having a draft makes any war much less palatable to the politicians. Because
yes, and used to be, of course, that there would be a recorded vote in Congress to enable the body politic to, put on boots and pick up guns. No longer.
No longer. Well, we have a professional army, although it's going to be downsized quite a bit now. And that will be a difficulty for a lot of the veterans, because some of these people have looked upon the Army as their ticket out of economic difficulty and opportunity to rise in the world, and that will be if we look at the fact that almost a third of the people who are homeless in our nation are veterans. We realize that some people have not made a very good adjustment after the war. And we have to ask ourselves, how come? And what is the real cost to society in terms of drug addiction, suicides? As you know, more than twice as many Vietnam veterans have taken their own lives than were killed in combat. And the number continues to climb. The cost to society of domestic violence, of assaults, child abuse, as well as the frank psychiatric disability of some veterans. War is a much more expensive proposition than Americans believe.
Yes, and I'm sure you read as well that the VA, which is the first resort of soldiers coming home who are injured physically, emotionally, morally, or otherwise, has an effective waiting list of something like 1.5 years before a soldier who applies for treatment can be seen, and that the statistics of availability have been jiggered a little bit so that the date applied for is moved to the date seen.
That's correct. That's correct. They're cooking the books.
They're cooking the books.
And we know this, and the Army knows this, which is interesting.
Yeah.
And the Army is very concerned about the welfare of the troops returning.
Absolutely. John, this has been a fascinating and important discussion. Thank you so much for coming, Dr. John Dyckman.
Thank you.
And this has been Healing from the Ground Up, the second of 2 programs on healing the wounded warrior. I'm Eric Greenleaf, and we will welcome you back next time. Thank you for watching.